I always believed that peace was something you built, not something you stumbled upon. After 20 years working as a county building inspector, walking through half-finished subdivisions, condemned structures, and zoning nightmares, I'd finally found my piece of heaven, an old lakeside cabin tucked away at the far edge of Cedar Ridge Lake. It wasn't much to look at when I bought it: rotting porch boards, a roof that whistled whenever the wind came through, and paint peeling like old sunburn, but it had something the city never could: silence. Real silence. Just the whisper of the trees and the soft lap of the lake against the shore. I'd spent years approving other people's dreams, signing off on luxury homes and polished neighborhoods, while living in a cramped apartment with a view of the highway. When I found the cabin, I told myself this was going to be my retirement project, the place I'd fix with my own hands: no permits needed, no meetings, no red tape, just wood, tools, and quiet. The land sat a few hundred feet outside the official boundary of the new Lakeshore Estates subdivision, a shiny, HOA-run development filled with modern glass houses, perfectly manicured lawns, and people who treated property lines like sacred scripture. I wasn't technically part of their HOA, and I made sure of that. The old deed, handwritten in cursive ink, clearly separated my half-acre from their jurisdiction. Still, the homeowners across the water acted like the lake belonged to them. Every weekend, they'd come out in their speedboats, blasting music that bounced off the water, their kids tossing beer cans that washed up on my shore. I ignored it. You learn patience when you've spent decades dealing with contractors who think inspection ready means hiding defects under fresh paint. But even patience has its limits. The first sign of trouble came the morning I found a white envelope pinned to my front gate with the HOA logo printed across the top. It wasn't addressed to me directly, just "Property Owner, Lot 17B." Inside was a notice of violation stating that my structure was non-compliant with the aesthetic and zoning standards of Lakeshore Estates. I chuckled when I read that. My cabin was built in 1963, long before their subdivision even existed. I tossed the letter into the fire pit and forgot about it. I figured it was a simple mix-up. But that was just the beginning of what would turn into one of the longest, most infuriating battles of my life. 2 weeks later, I was repairing the dock when I noticed a small group of people standing by the fence: 3 men in matching blue polos with clipboards, and a woman in a sun hat holding a tablet. The woman waved as I approached. "Good morning," she said brightly. "I'm Karen Hill, president of the Lakeshore Estates Homeowners Association." Of course she was. I'd seen her before, driving around in her white Lexus, barking into her phone. The type who thought rules were a weapon, not a guideline. She smiled that tight, polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We've received several complaints about an unapproved dwelling encroaching on community property," she said. I wiped my hands on my jeans. "This cabin's been here since before your HOA existed. My property line's marked right there by the old oak." She glanced at her tablet. "According to our survey, the boundary extends 20 feet beyond that oak, meaning your cabin actually overlaps the greenbelt easement belonging to Lakeshore Estates. You'll need to submit an architectural review request and bring the structure into compliance, or remove it." I could feel the heat rising in my chest. "Ma'am," I said, keeping my tone steady, "I've got the county plat map and title deed that say otherwise. Your survey's wrong." Her smile didn't fade. "Then you can submit an appeal to the HOA board. We meet every first Thursday of the month. Until then, consider this your formal notice." She handed me another envelope and turned away before I could say another word. The men behind her snapped a few pictures of my cabin, as if it were some illegal shack on government land. That night, I sat on the porch with a cold beer, staring out at the moonlit water, trying to calm the anger bubbling inside me. It wasn't just about the cabin. It was about the arrogance. The way people like her thought their little bylaws could override decades of county land records. I'd spent my career enforcing those same codes, fairly, by the book. I knew every loophole, every statute, every line in the local ordinances. I could quote them in my sleep. And part of me almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Because she had no idea who she was dealing with. I filed a quiet boundary verification request at the county office the next day, not as the property owner, but as an inspector. Old habits die hard. Within 48 hours, I had the original plats, the zoning overlays, and the subdivision expansion records in front of me. Sure enough, my property, Lot 43 of the original Cedar Ridge Lake development, was explicitly excluded from the Lakeshore Estate's jurisdiction. The HOA had no legal authority over my land. None. Their survey was self-generated and never approved by the county. I printed copies, had them notarized, and placed one in my safe. The rest I tucked away for later. The following weekend, I caught two men from the HOA maintenance crew stringing yellow tape along the edge of my fence. I walked up calmly. "What are you doing?" One of them hesitated. "Boundary marking," he said. "The board ordered a cleanup of encroachments." "Encroachments," I repeated slowly, stepping closer. "You're on private land." "My land." They exchanged nervous glances. "You'll need to talk to Mrs. Hill," one said, backing away. I did more than that. I called the county sheriff's non-emergency line and reported trespassing. When the deputy arrived, I handed him the notarized documents and a map. Karen Hill showed up minutes later, fuming. She tried to argue, waving her tablet around, but the deputy wasn't buying it. "Ma'am," he said, "this property is outside your HOA boundary. You can't enforce your bylaws here." The look on her face was priceless. She sputtered something about community standards and neighborhood aesthetics, but the deputy shut her down. They left, but I knew it wouldn't be the end. People like Karen didn't quit when they were wrong, they just regrouped and came back meaner. Sure enough, the next month, I returned from a work inspection in another county to find my gate cut open. My cabin, my home, was gone. Reduced to a pile of splintered timber and dust. The air still smelled of diesel and fresh dirt. I stood there frozen, my mind blank, my heart pounding in disbelief. Where my porch once stood, there was now a plastic sign staked into the ground, "Property cleared for community green space by order of Lakeshore Estates HOA." For a moment, I couldn't even breathe. I walked through the rubble like a man in a nightmare. My grandfather's rocking chair, the one I'd restored last winter, lay cracked in half. My tools, my photos, the hand-carved mantle I'd built, all gone. The bastards had bulldozed everything. I found a man in a reflective vest still packing up equipment near the road. "Who authorized this?" I demanded. He looked startled. "The HOA," he said. "We were told the county ordered demolition due to zoning violations." I laughed, short, bitter, and disbelieving. "The county?" I said. "I am the county." He blinked, not understanding, and hurried off to his truck. As I stood there watching the dust settle, something inside me shifted. Years of patience, years of quiet professionalism, all the self-control I'd built, it cracked. They'd made a mistake bigger than any permit violation I'd ever seen. They thought they could play demolition crew with someone's life, someone's memories. They thought they could forge authority and get away with it. But I wasn't some random homeowner. I knew the law better than any of them ever would. And if they wanted a fight, they were about to get one, on the record, line by line, violation by violation. That night, I opened my laptop, pulled up the county record system, and began documenting everything. The illegal demolition. The trespassing. The falsified authorization forms I suspected they'd used. I wasn't just going to rebuild my cabin. I was going to make sure every single person who had a hand in its destruction paid for it, legally, publicly, and thoroughly. And as the moon rose over the empty lake, I made myself a promise: they wanted to play with permits and codes. Fine. I'd show them what real enforcement looked like. The rage that sat in my chest after the demolition was not the quick, hot flare of anger, It was a slow-working, precise kind of fury that comes from someone who knows the machinery of a system well enough to find the exact gear to jam. I dug through county files like a miner looking for gold, permits, demolition orders, contractor licenses, and email trails, until the pieces began to line up. The HOA had contracted a private firm to clear blighted structures and produce a signed order supposedly from the county permitting the demolition. Whoever signed that authorization had used my name and my badge number. It was crude, obvious forgery, a scrawl meant to look like my signature to anyone who didn't know me. My blood ran cold and then hot all over again. They had tried to weaponize my identity as an inspector to give their land grab legitimacy. That crossed a line I couldn't ignore because it wasn't only about me, it was about the sanctity of the office I had spent 20 years building, enforcing codes fairly, protecting public safety, and ensuring that power wasn't a club for the loud and wealthy. So I started building my case. First, I secured affidavits from neighbors who had watched the crew arrive the morning the cabin disappeared. Mrs. Aguilar, who lived 2 doors down and tended the community garden, corroborated the time the equipment showed up. A kid on a skateboard recorded a shaky smartphone video of heavy machinery idling on the access road while men in reflective vests spread tarps over piles of personal items. I had the deputy's report from the trespass call, which noted the HOA's presence earlier that month. I subpoenaed the demolition contractor's invoices and found a suspiciously small line item for a county authorization fee routed through an LLC registered to a mailbox in town. From there it was a pattern. Invoices shuffled through shell companies, phone records showing calls between the HOA president's number and an operations manager at the firm, and an email thread where the operations manager insisted they needed an official look to avoid any community pushback. The emails were tacit, slimy, full of euphemisms, but they were there, and they smelled like guilt. I compiled everything into a folder thick enough to crack and walked it straight into the county prosecutor's office. I didn't want to rely solely on the letter of my badge to do the work, I wanted the law to bite at their heels. The prosecutor's eyes widened as I laid the evidence out on her conference table. For the first time since this whole mess started, I felt an odd, cautious relief. She agreed to open an investigation into fraud, trespass, and destruction of private property. Meanwhile, I filed a civil suit to recover what I could and to place emergency injunctive holds on further encroachments to the lakeshore. The paperwork read like a weapon forged in ink, affidavits, sworn statements, motions for temporary restraining orders. I marshaled the things I loved into evidence, photographs of the cabin before, notes about heirlooms and artifacts destroyed, receipts for materials replaced by someone else's bulldozer, and my own testimony as a county inspector whose identity had been used as a cudgel. I also began a quieter fight, fixing my own sense of being seen. For all their polished lawns and uniformed smugness, Lakeshore Estates had neighbors, a surprising number of whom were quietly resentful of the HOA's small part pretensions and overreach. I started knocking on doors, not to lecture, but to tell my story as an inspector and as a neighbor who had lost more than a building. People listened. A retired surveyor who had once done some consulting for the HOA admitted that he'd known their boundary maps were optimistic at best. A contractor confessed he'd been pressured by the HOA to turn a blind eye to irregularities on other properties. A few homeowners, nursing their own private rebellions about barking rules and intrusive inspections, handed over documents and testimonies that made the HOA's empire look thinner than its glossy brochure. I learned to harness the quiet power of small confessions. In less than a month, my civil filings and the prosecutor's investigation combined into a public spectacle that the HOA could not hide from. Local news picked it up after a whistleblower, one of the crewmen who felt guilty, handed over a voice memo where the operations manager joked about using the inspector's name to grease the deal. That voice memo was a centerpiece. Channel 7 ran a segment about an inspector whose identity was forged and a lakeside cabin flattened under the auspices of community beautification. The HOA's board responded with a terse press release claiming they acted in good faith, based on documentation they believed to be legitimate. Good faith did not explain the shell invoices, nor the scarce record trail of a supposed county signatory. Good faith did not answer for a grandfather's rocking chair smashed beyond repair. But the release did something more insidious. It painted their critics as petty, uncooperative, or jealous. That spin was their default posture. I refused to be pulled into their narratives. I kept supplying the prosecutor with documents and witnesses, and I made my civil suit as methodical as an inspection, each exhibit labeled, organized, and cross-referenced. I demanded the HOA produce the original paperwork they claimed authorized the demolition. They produced a photocopy with a motion-activated signature that, under scrutiny, didn't match the security features of county-issued authorizations. Experts my attorney hired testified that the signature line had been tampered with, that metadata in the PDF was inconsistent, that timestamps had been altered. The county's internal audit found no record of any demolition order under my name or under any authorized inspector's name. Criminal referrals were issued. The higher-ups in the HOA tried to dodge by pointing fingers at the contractor, but the contractor's books showed payments that traced back to HOA accounts and a series of checks with memos that read, "lot clearing." One of the board members, a man with a carefully cultivated public image as a philanthropist, suddenly found his weekend volunteer hours scrutinized under a brighter light when his private companies were subpoenaed. The pressure on Lakeshore estates grew like a winter storm overtaking thin ice. Cracks began to show. The HOA board voted to suspend its president and initiated an internal review, a move that felt like rearranging deck chairs to avoid a lawsuit. She, of course, denied wrongdoing and hired a lawyer who specialized in public relations as much as litigation. But words on a glossy letterhead could not replace evidence. The prosecutor forwarded the case to the county grand jury, and a grand jury is a machine that chews up plausible deniability if the facts are laid plain. Throughout all this, I kept returning to the lake at dusk, to the empty patch of shoreline where the cabin had stood. The water reflected a sky that had nothing to do with bylaw language or forged authorizations. Grief and anger softened there into something practical, plans. I sketched new designs for a cabin that would rise from the rubble like a dare, designs that respected the code but also thumbed a subtle nose at hubris, reclaimed wood, low profile, a dock rebuilt by neighbors who had lent their time and their boats to carry materials. I coordinated volunteers, not as a crusader, but as a man who wanted his place back and wanted it built by hands that knew it mattered. The prosecutor's investigation and my civil suit moved more slowly than my temper wanted. But in those pauses small victories came. A contractor implicated in the falsified documents resigned and agreed to cooperate, and one board member quietly turned over internal emails showing they had discussed the benefit of removing older structures to boost property values. The grand jury returned an indictment against two individuals, the operations manager and the HOA president, on charges of fraud and conspiracy to commit property destruction. It was satisfying in a quiet, bureaucratic way, the kind of satisfaction that comes from watching a system you respect actually work. But criminal charges were not a cure for what had been lost. The cabin could be rebuilt, but my grandfather's hands could not be replaced, the smell of old cedar that sank into the rafters could not be conjured again. There would be a trial, a reckoning of sorts, and there would be restitution to pursue. More than anything, I realized that the fragility of private memory in the face of institutional hubris was a hazard that needed to be named. I testified at a county meeting about tighter oversight of demolition authorizations and chain of custody procedures for permits. I rewired a few internal processes so that no one could, with a photocopy and a forged signature, remove someone's life from a lakeshore and call it progress. It was gratifying to see actual policy change, small but meaningful, roll out through the county. And when the first nail went into the rebuilt porch, hammered by a neighbor who had brought his old toolbox and a thermos of coffee, it felt like a small victory stitched to a long fight, a moment where the community's quiet, stubborn decency fixed what arrogance had attempted to smash. The months that followed the indictments felt like living in a quiet storm, one where the thunder was always distant but the pressure never left the air. I had won the first round, but rebuilding wasn't as simple as driving nails into fresh wood. Every morning before heading to the county office, I stopped by the lot, stared at the new foundation, and let the smell of wet earth remind me that the world still moved forward. The new cabin was taking shape slower than I wanted, mostly because I refused to rush it. I designed every beam and joint myself, submitted every permit under my own name, double-checked every approval through the very departments I used to oversee. The irony wasn't lost on me, the county inspector now being inspected, his own work scrutinized like a lesson in humility. I welcomed it. Each stamped approval felt like reclaiming a piece of the order they'd tried to steal. But beneath the progress there was a deeper current of bitterness that refused to drain away. I saw Karen Hill's face on local news one morning, walking briskly into the courthouse surrounded by reporters, her lawyer holding a folder in front of her like a shield. She looked smaller without the Lexus and the authority of her HOA badge, just another person realizing the walls she'd built to protect her vanity were made of glass. The reporters shouted her name as she passed, but she never looked up. The trial had begun. Inside that courtroom, I sat on the witness stand more times than I cared to count. The attorneys for the HOA president tried to paint the demolition as a misunderstanding, procedural miscommunication, they called it, the kind that supposedly happens when paperwork travels through too many hands. I sat there, hands clasped, eyes steady, explaining how county authorization forms were stored, signed, tracked, and logged. I explained how the document they used was impossible to have come from our office, how even the watermark was wrong. I walked the jury through the timeline, the survey dispute, the trespass, the forged paperwork, the demolition. My voice stayed calm, professional, but inside me burned a restrained fire. Every photo they showed of the destroyed cabin felt like someone twisting a knife that still hadn't been removed. My attorney presented the video from the kid's phone, the signed affidavits, and the county verification records proving I was out of town the day the demolition permit was supposedly approved. When the defense tried to suggest that I had an old grudge against the HOA, I smiled faintly and let them hang themselves with their own argument. I was the one who had approved dozens of their building permits in the past without a single issue. The courtroom went quiet when I said that, and for the first time, I saw something like doubt flicker in Karen's eyes. She avoided looking at me the rest of the day. By the second week, it was clear the jury wasn't buying their story. The prosecution laid out the chain of communication, emails, invoices, the voice recording, each one a nail in the coffin of their defense. When the contractor who had done the demolition took the stand and admitted he was told the county inspector had authorized it personally, the courtroom went still. He pointed to me, voice shaking, and said he'd recognized my name on the form but never met me. His eyes flicked toward Karen and her lawyer. That was the moment I saw her composure crack. She leaned forward, whispered something to her attorney, and for the first time since the whole nightmare began, I felt like the truth was finally louder than her arrogance. When the verdict came, it was quiet, no cheers, no outburst, just a long silence that settled over the room like a held breath finally released. Guilty. Fraud. Conspiracy. Falsifying government documents. Karen Hill and the operations manager were both convicted. Sentencing was scheduled a month later, but for me, the trial was already over. I walked out of that courtroom and stood under the bright noon sun, breathing air that felt different, lighter somehow. The news vans swarmed, but I didn't stop to give interviews. There was nothing more to say that the evidence hadn't already shouted. Justice, for once, didn't need a headline. Back at the lake, the new cabin stood almost complete. The siding was cedar, treated and golden under the sunlight, with black trim that reflected the water's blue. The porch was broader than before, built sturdy enough for generations. Neighbors came by on weekends, bringing sandwiches, lending tools, helping with the roof. It wasn't charity, it was solidarity, quiet and real. These were people who'd watched me lose everything, who had their own stories of HOA bullying, their own grudges buried under polite suburban smiles. Together we hammered nails not just into wood, but into the myth that money and titles could bend the law. At night, when everyone had gone home and the last embers glowed in the fire pit, I'd sit on the steps and listen to the lake lap against the dock. The reflection of the half-built roof shimmered in the water, and for the first time since the bulldozers came, I felt something like peace. Then came the next twist, one I didn't expect. A few weeks after the verdict, a man from the state licensing board showed up at my office. He introduced himself politely, said he was following up on a complaint of conflict of interest. Apparently, someone had filed an anonymous report claiming that I had used my position as a county inspector to influence the investigation for personal gain. I knew exactly where that came from. Even behind bars, Karen Hill's connections in the HOA world still had reach. They wanted to smear me, drag me into a bureaucratic mud pit to make me look no better than them. The irony stung. They had forged my name to demolish my home, and now they wanted to accuse me of abusing the same authority they stole. But I wasn't the same man I'd been months ago. I'd learned patience sharper than steel. I opened my files, provided every email, every record, every permit request, every communication with the prosecutor. The board investigator left my office 2 hours later with a folder thicker than his briefcase and a quiet look of apology in his eyes. The complaint was dismissed a week later. Still, the message was clear: power doesn't surrender easily, even when it's caught red-handed. That fall, the county hosted a building safety symposium downtown. I'd been asked to give a presentation on permit fraud and prevention. Standing at the podium, looking out at a room full of contractors, inspectors, and city planners, I realized how far I'd come from that morning when I stood staring at a pile of rubble by the lake. I talked about how simple procedural safeguards, chain of custody logs, signature verification, public access to permit databases, could prevent what had happened to me. But underneath the technical language, my voice carried something more personal. It wasn't just about paperwork. It was about dignity. About how easily bureaucracy could be turned into a weapon when accountability falters. When I finished, the applause was polite but genuine. A few younger inspectors came up afterward, telling me my case had inspired their departments to audit their systems. That, more than any legal victory, felt like closure. Not complete closure, I'd never get that, but enough to breathe again. As winter approached, the lake froze around the edges, and I moved back into the new cabin full-time. The first night I slept there, the wind howled against the windows, and for a moment I thought I heard echoes of the bulldozers, but they faded into the sound of the ice shifting. I lit the fireplace and let the warmth fill the room, staring at the photographs on the mantel, duplicates of the ones I'd lost, reprinted from old drives and neighbors' archives. It wasn't the same, but it was something. I'd built new memories over ashes, like a phoenix made of cedar and stubborn will. People from the county still dropped by sometimes, curious to see the inspector's cabin. I never minded. I even kept a copy of the verdict framed by the door, not out of pride, but as a reminder of what happens when arrogance meets accountability. In the months that followed, the Lakeshore Estates HOA changed leadership twice. The board was now run by a mix of younger families and retirees who wanted to keep the peace. They reached out, surprisingly humble, asking if I'd be willing to consult on revising their bylaws to prevent abuses of power. At first, I wanted nothing to do with it. I wanted them gone, forgotten, a chapter closed. But then I thought about the bigger picture, about how many other communities were run by little tyrants in business suits pretending to serve their neighbors. Maybe this was my chance to turn pain into prevention. So I agreed. I sat in their meeting room one evening, the same kind of sterile clubhouse that used to symbolize everything I hated, and laid out a plan for transparency, open board meetings, public access to finances, mandatory third-party oversight for enforcement actions. The irony wasn't lost on me, the man whose home they destroyed now writing the rules to keep them from hurting anyone else. They listened. They voted. And for once, the motion passed unanimously. By spring, my cabin was complete, and the grass along the shore grew thick and green again. The water shimmered like nothing bad had ever happened there. I built a small wooden sign at the end of the dock that read, "Still Standing." It wasn't for anyone else to see, just for me. Life has a strange way of balancing itself when you least expect it. I never asked for revenge, only fairness. And fairness, eventually, came back around, not through anger, but through patience, truth, and work. The sun rose every morning over the lake, and the reflection of that new cabin glowed brighter than the bitterness I'd once carried. The world moved on, and so did I, not as a victim or even a victor, but as a man who knew that sometimes the law isn't just written in books, sometimes, it's rebuilt in wood, nail by nail, on the edge of a quiet lake. Spring at Cedar Ridge Lake had always carried a quiet promise, that no matter how harsh the winter, the earth always finds a way to start again. By the time the ice melted off the dock and the first green shoots pushed through the soil, the whole ordeal with the HOA had begun to feel like something from another lifetime. The scars were still there, of course, not just the physical ones left behind by the bulldozers, but the deeper ones carved into trust, into the way I looked at authority. Yet, standing on the porch of the cabin I had rebuilt with my own hands, I realized that scars aren't always ugly. Sometimes they're proof that you survived. The county had officially closed the criminal case, the sentences were handed down, and restitution payments had been ordered. It wasn't much, money rarely balances the weight of loss, but the gesture mattered. Karen Hill was serving time, her name stripped from the HOA board and from the state property records she'd once treated like her kingdom. The community she tried to control now wanted nothing to do with her. Lakeshore Estates, ironically, was calmer without her reign. The lawns were still manicured, the houses still modern, but the tension had lifted. Neighbors who once looked at me like a trespasser now waved when they passed my dock. Life had a way of turning full circle when you let truth do the heavy lifting. I returned to my old habits, early mornings, coffee steaming on the porch rail, notebook open with sketches and inspection notes. I was still a county building inspector, but something inside me had shifted about how I did the job. I no longer saw blueprints and permits as paperwork alone, I saw them as the fragile architecture of people's lives. A small signature in the wrong place could destroy a dream, and I'd lived that truth firsthand. So I became more meticulous, more patient with applicants, more transparent with my team. Younger inspectors came to me for guidance, and I taught them the same lesson life had driven into me, that power means nothing if you forget empathy. That summer, the county board recognized my work during a public meeting. They handed me a plaque for exemplary service in public integrity. I didn't need it, but I accepted it anyway, not for pride, but for the quiet validation that sometimes doing things the right way, even when it costs you everything, still matters. After the applause faded, I drove straight back to the lake. The cabin was waiting, warm and golden in the evening light, as if it had been listening all along. As word of my story spread, I started getting letters, real paper letters, from people all over the state. Homeowners who'd been harassed by HOAs, small-town residents whose properties had been threatened, builders who'd been fined unfairly. They didn't just want legal advice, they wanted reassurance that they weren't powerless. Some of them mailed photos of their homes, their gardens, their porches, their pieces of heaven they were fighting to protect. I read every one of them. I couldn't respond to all, but when I could, I sent back notes reminding them of the same thing that had kept me standing: documentation is power. Truth leaves a paper trail. One letter stood out, a man from the next county over, whose father's old fishing shack was being threatened by another HOA's environmental beautification project. He'd heard about my story and wanted help. I drove out one Saturday, just to see. The shack reminded me of my old cabin before the rebuild, weathered wood, peeling paint, a lifetime of memories in every nail. The HOA there had claimed it violated shoreline aesthetic standards. I reviewed their paperwork, and within an hour, I saw the same pattern: inflated boundary maps, fabricated easements, and a questionable approval notice missing the county watermark. It was déjà vu. I called the HOA president into a meeting and introduced myself formally: county building inspector. The look on his face told me everything. Within 2 weeks, they withdrew their claim and issued a public apology to the homeowner. The man sent me a jar of lake honey as thanks. It wasn't about the honey, it was about justice echoing across the water in small, stubborn ripples. By midsummer, I'd quietly become the person people called when they needed help against HOA overreach. I never advertised, never charged a cent, it wasn't about that. It was about balance. Each case I helped with felt like another board nailed down on the metaphorical floor of fairness. The county even created a small advisory committee to review community association complaints, and I was invited to lead it. I accepted, on one condition, that it would operate transparently, open to the public, no closed-door decisions. The first meeting was held right there at the Lakeshore Community Center, the same building where, a year earlier, Karen Hill had tried to threaten me with bylaws and surveys. Now, the tables were turned in the best way possible. I sat at the head of the room, not out of ego, but to remind everyone that authority isn't a weapon when it's rooted in service. We reviewed 3 complaints that evening, all involving HOA abuse of power. In each one, the homeowners presented their documents nervously, expecting dismissal. Instead, we listened. We asked for facts. We helped. When the session ended, a young couple came up to me. They just moved into Lakeshore Estates, unaware of its troubled past, and thanked me for making it livable again. I told them it wasn't me. It was accountability. It was neighbors deciding that fairness mattered more than fences. The nights that summer were long and kind. The air was thick with the scent of pine and lake water, and fireflies danced above the reeds. Sometimes, I'd sit with old friends on the dock, talking about everything and nothing. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange, my longtime friend and colleague, Deputy Alvarez, joined me. He was the same officer who'd answered my first trespassing call that day months ago. He brought a cooler of beer and 2 lawn chairs. We sat in silence for a while before he said, "You know, it's strange. I've seen people lose homes before, but I've never seen anyone turn it into a mission." I smiled faintly, watching the reflection of the fading light on the water. "Maybe that's what happens when you've seen how the system works from both sides," I told him. "You either let it break you, or you learn to rebuild differently." He nodded, tapping his can against mine. The sound echoed like a quiet salute. That was the thing about true justice, it didn't need a crowd or applause, it just needed endurance. By the time autumn rolled around again, the leaves had started to turn, painting the lake's edge in gold and red. The cabin, now fully furnished and lived in, felt like a living memory stitched with fresh purpose. I built a small workshop beside it, a place for my tools, my designs, and sometimes, for the people who came by needing help with their own blueprints or permits. It wasn't just a home anymore, it had become a kind of local landmark, a symbol of what happens when you stand your ground. I never asked for that role, but life had a way of appointing you where you're needed most. Reporters occasionally returned to follow up, asking for updates, but I always told them the same thing: the story's over, the lesson's what matters. And still, the calls came in, the letters arrived, the neighbors dropped by. In their voices, I heard echoes of my own anger from that first day, but also the same flicker of hope I'd found through rebuilding. The cabin had become more than a structure, it was proof that integrity could outlast greed. One evening, I found myself sorting through an old storage box I'd salvaged from the rubble months earlier. Inside were things I'd forgotten about: a broken compass, an old county-issued tape measure, and a folded photograph of my father standing on the porch of our family home decades ago. On the back, in his slanted handwriting, were the words, "Measure twice, build once, for walls and for life." I sat there for a long time, staring at that sentence, realizing how much of him lived in the way I worked, the way I fought, the way I refused to bend. Maybe the cabin wasn't just a rebuild, maybe it was a continuation of his legacy, a lesson still unfolding. I placed the photo in a new frame and hung it above my desk. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying the faint sound of water lapping against the shore, as if the lake itself was nodding in quiet approval. As that year closed, I understood something deeper than I had before. The fight with the HOA, the trial, the rebuilding, all of it wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. Not just of a cabin, but of faith, faith in law, in community, in resilience. I had gone from being a man who just wanted peace by the lake to someone who understood that peace sometimes demands a war of patience. The cabin still stood, the water still shimmered, and in the silence of that lakeside evening, I realized I had built more than a home. I had built closure, steady, quiet, and unshakable as the ground beneath it. Winter returned to the lake like a slow, forgiving breath. The water froze again along the shallows, and mist curled over the surface in the early mornings like ghostly smoke. By then, the cabin had settled into its rhythm, creaking softly in the cold, its chimney puffing a thin trail of wood smoke into the pale sky. Life had fallen into something simple, something honest. I woke up each day before dawn, made coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and watched the sun climb behind the black silhouettes of pine trees. Some days I worked, inspecting new builds, reviewing plans, mentoring junior inspectors. Other days, I simply sat with my dog, Rusty, watching the lake hold its breath before the thaw. It had been over a year since the demolition, since the chaos, since the courtrooms and flashing headlines. People had moved on, as they always do, but I hadn't forgotten. I didn't want to. The memory of what happened had become a compass, not one that pointed north, but one that pointed true. When the county offered me a promotion, Senior Regional Building Officer, I almost turned it down. It meant less time at the lake, more time in meetings, more bureaucracy. But then I thought about what it would mean to have someone in that chair who understood what power without empathy could do. I accepted, but I made one condition clear: any community under my jurisdiction had to establish a transparent homeowners code, reviewed and signed by both residents and inspectors. No more backdoor deals, no more fake surveys, no more beautification projects that bulldozed lives. The county board agreed. Over the following months, we implemented those changes. It was slow, frustrating work, convincing lawyers, rewriting statutes, explaining to HOAs that oversight wasn't an attack, but protection. Still, little by little, it changed. I began to see reports come in about fairer hearings, open budgets, and more cooperative boards. The work spread further than I ever imagined. One night, while sorting through correspondence at home, I received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a photograph, a lakeside cabin, small but strong, rebuilt after an HOA conflict in another county. Scrawled on the back were 4 words: "You started this movement." I didn't know who sent it, but it meant more than any award could. The following spring, I was invited to give a guest talk at the local university's civic planning department. I almost laughed when I got the email. Public speaking was never my thing, but something in me said yes. The auditorium wasn't big, maybe 50 students and a few faculty members, but as I stood at the podium, I felt that same nervous fire I'd had the day I confronted Karen Hill at the town hall. I told them everything. Not the dramatized version that had made the papers, but the truth. How one misused ordinance had led to a demolition. How one inspector's silence could destroy a dream. How standing up, even when it's lonely, can change an entire system. The room stayed silent through most of it. When I finished, a student in the back, a young woman with a notebook full of scribbles, raised her hand and asked, "If you could go back, would you do anything differently?" I thought for a long moment before answering. "No," I said finally. Because every nail I lost taught me where not to build next time. The room broke into quiet applause, not loud, but genuine. That night, as I walked out under the cool stars, I realized the story wasn't just mine anymore. It had become a lesson, one built plank by plank from the ruins of my old life. Years rolled on, and Cedar Ridge Lake remained my constant. The seasons changed, the county grew, and new families moved into the community. Children rode bikes down roads that had once been battlefields of bureaucracy. The HOA, restructured and renamed under new leadership, became a model of fairness. Imagine that, the same neighborhood that once tore my cabin down now held an annual, Community Heritage Day, celebrating the lake's history, with local artists, food stalls, and small boat parades. The new HOA president, a soft-spoken man named Richard, invited me every year as an honorary guest. The first time I attended, I'll admit I hesitated. But when I arrived, people greeted me warmly. They'd built a small wooden sign near the water's edge that read, "The Rebuild, in honor of those who stand for what's right." I stood there for a long time, hand resting on the sign, feeling something I hadn't in years, peace without weight. The kind of peace that doesn't come from winning a fight, but from knowing it mattered that you fought at all. My cabin aged gracefully through it all. The porch steps creaked the same way they always had, the oak table I'd built bore the faint rings of 1,000 coffee mugs, and the dock stretched out like an open hand into the water. I added small touches over time, a weather vane shaped like a compass, a new rocking chair, a lantern that glowed golden at night. Friends still came by, and sometimes I'd tell them the story. Not the angry version. Not the vengeful version. Just the honest one. About how one man's stubbornness met one woman's arrogance, and somehow, justice grew out of the wreckage. Some nights, when the wind was calm, I swore I could still hear the distant echoes of the bulldozers that once tore through my land, but they didn't bring anger anymore. They sounded like ghosts from a story that had already ended. One quiet evening, I received a visitor I didn't expect. It was Marcia Hill, Karen's younger sister. She looked different from how I remembered her, older, humbled, but not bitter. She stood at my gate for a long time before I walked down to meet her. "You probably don't want to see me," she said softly. But I needed to say this. My sister, she lost herself in that job. She thought control was the same as care. She paid the price for it. I just wanted you to know I'm sorry for what she did to you. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The lake was still, the air sharp with pine. I finally said, "You don't owe me an apology, Marcia. Life already handed out the lessons." She nodded, tears in her eyes, and handed me a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note from Karen herself, sent from prison. It read, "You were right. I forgot what rules were meant for. I hope you find peace where I couldn't." I folded the note, tucked it into my jacket pocket, and told Marcia to take care of herself. As she walked away, I realized that even forgiveness has its own architecture, delicate, quiet, and hard-earned. That night, I sat by the fire, Karen's note resting on the table beside my father's photo. The flames cracked, casting long shadows across the cabin walls. I thought about everything, the cabin that was demolished, the one I rebuilt, the laws that changed, the people who learned, and the man I'd become. There was a strange beauty in it all, the way chaos had carved out clarity, the way loss had led to purpose. The storm that once destroyed everything had, in its own twisted way, given me a reason to rebuild more than just wood and nails. It had rebuilt me. Outside, the moon rose over the frozen lake, glowing on the snow like spilled silver. Rusty lay at my feet, snoring softly, content in a world that finally felt still. Sometimes, when people ask me now what justice feels like, I tell them this: it doesn't sound like a gavel or look like a courtroom. It feels like the warmth of a cabin rebuilt by hand. It smells like sawdust and pine after a long day's work. It sounds like silence, the kind that follows when the noise of unfairness finally dies. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's quiet, patient, and steady, like the rhythm of waves against a wooden dock. I learned that lesson the hard way, but I wouldn't trade it for anything. Years from now, when I'm long gone and this cabin stands without me, I hope someone will walk these floors, touch the wood grain, and feel the story still alive in it. Maybe they'll find the old compass on the shelf or the framed quote above the desk that says, "Measure twice, build once." Maybe they'll understand that those words weren't just about construction, they were about life. Because that's what my father tried to teach me, and what this place proved beyond any doubt: you can rebuild anything, if you build it with truth. And so, here I am, an old inspector in a cabin by the lake, content to listen to the whispers of water and wind. The world outside keeps spinning, the county keeps changing, but my story has found its ending. The cabin stands where it was once erased. The man who once lost everything now owns peace that no one can demolish. And the lake, faithful and eternal, keeps reflecting the sky, reminding me every day that even after the worst storms, calm always returns.